The house has gone quiet. Not the silence of a room, but the deeper silence that settles over a building when everyone in it has finally stopped moving. You can feel it in the absence of sound. No footsteps overhead, no distant television, no car passing the window with that brief wash of headlights that reminds you the world is still out there. It is late. You are still awake. There is a feeling that comes at this hour. Not sadness exactly, not anxiety in the restless, heart-pounding sense. Something quieter than both. A kind of flatness. The sense that things you expected to want have stopped calling to you. That the reasons you had, the ones that got you through the day, feel thin and unconvincing here in the dark. Most people do not have a word for this. They call it tiredness, or stress, or midlife, or burnout. They wait for it to pass. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it comes back the next night and the one after that. Tonight, we bring the work of one man to this hour. Soren Kierkegaard spent his entire life thinking about this feeling. Not about depression, not about mental illness in any clinical sense, about the specific philosophical condition of a self that has lost its ground. He had a word for it that most people find uncomfortable: despair. But his definition of despair has almost nothing to do with hopelessness. It has to do with the self, with what the self requires in order to become itself. We will take 4 hours to walk through his work. There is no need to follow every word. Some chapters you will carry into sleep before they finish. The parts that matter will find you anyway. Before we begin, notice the weight of your body where it rests. The bed beneath you, the pillow, your hands wherever they are. Your shoulders, let them drop. There are 2 kinds of despair Kierkegaard named. Most of us carry one of them without knowing what it is called. By the time we arrive at the 2nd hour, you will recognize which one is yours. That is the first open question we carry into the night. And there are 3 stages of existence that Kierkegaard mapped over the course of his life. Most people live in one of them without having chosen it. Tonight, we trace all 3, and somewhere in the tracing, the one you inhabit will show itself. The room is still. Let your jaw soften. We begin at the beginning, in a city you have never been to, in a century you did not live through, Copenhagen, Denmark. The year is 1813. A child is born to a wool merchant who has spent the better part of his life carrying a secret he believes has cursed his family. The child will be the 7th. He will outlive his 6 siblings. He will never outlive his father's guilt. His name is Soren Kierkegaard. By the time he is 30, he will have written some of the strangest, most beautiful, most difficult books in the European philosophical tradition. He will write them under false names. He will write them for a woman who does not know he is writing for her. He will spend the rest of his life arguing with a church he loves too much to pretend is well. He will die at 42 in a hospital bed in Copenhagen, refusing to take communion from a priest, insisting that only a layperson, not an official of the church he had spent his last years attacking, could offer it. He understood, as well as anyone has ever understood, what it means to stand in the middle of your own life and feel that the meaning has gone out of it. That is where we are starting tonight, here, in the hour after midnight, in the ordinary dark of your room, with the feeling that has no name but the one Kierkegaard left behind. Something shifts here. We are going deeper. Chapter 2. A man who understood this. Copenhagen, in the first decade of the 19th century, was a city recovering from catastrophe. The British bombardment of 1807 had left much of the old harbour district in ruins. The economy was broken. The winter was cold, and in a tall house on Nytorv Square, a man named Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard sat with a fortune he had made in wool and a guilt he could not put down. Michael Kierkegaard was, by all accounts, a formidable man. He had come from nothing, a peasant boy from Jutland who had walked to Copenhagen as a child and worked his way into prosperity with a ferocity that left little room for lightness. He was deeply religious, learned, severe with himself, and haunted by something he would not name until near the end of his life. He believed he had cursed his family. In his youth, starving on the Jutland heath, he had stood on a hill and cursed God. He was perhaps 12 years old. He was cold and hungry and alone, and he directed at the sky an anger that he would spend the rest of his life trying to atone for. He came to believe that this act had placed his family under divine punishment. His wife died. 5 of his 7 children died before him. He outlived them all. The youngest child, Soren, watched his father age. He watched him pray and study scripture and sit for hours in the silence that religious guilt produces. He absorbed the atmosphere of that house, the way a child absorbs everything, through the skin, without knowing it is happening. What he absorbed was this: that the world has depths that the surface does not show, that guilt is a permanent weight, not a passing shadow, that the self has a relationship to something beyond itself, and that the terms of that relationship matter more than almost anything else. He did not absorb these as conclusions, he absorbed them as questions. Feel the weight of your body. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. In 1830, at 17, Soren Kierkegaard enrolled at the University of Copenhagen to study theology. He was not a good student in any conventional sense. He was brilliant, restless, argumentative, and more interested in the questions behind the curriculum than in the curriculum itself. He read voraciously outside his field. Socrates, above all, became the figure he returned to again and again. Socrates, who had said that the unexamined life is not worth living, and who had demonstrated this claim by examining everything, including the people around him, until they asked him to stop by, giving him a cup of hemlock. Kierkegaard recognized in Socrates something he had grown up with. The man who takes the questions seriously enough to let them cost something. He was 22 years old. He had 5 years of university still ahead of him. His father was still alive. And somewhere across Copenhagen, a young woman named Regine Olsen was 10 years old and had no idea that one of the strangest love stories in the history of philosophy was about to involve her. We carry that forward. The story deepens. Chapter 3. The strange word he used. Before we go further into the life, we should sit with the word despair. In ordinary use, the word means something close to hopelessness. The final giving up. The person who has given up on tomorrow. But Kierkegaard used it differently, technically, philosophically, with precision, and his definition is the one that matters tonight, because it is far more useful than the ordinary one. For Kierkegaard, despair is not primarily a feeling, it is a condition. It is a specific relationship between the self and what the self is meant to become. Here is the core of it, as simply as it can be said. The self is not a fixed thing. It is not something you are born with complete and then carry through life like a stone in your pocket. The self is something you are always in the process of becoming. It is a task, a project, a relation between what you are and what you could be. Despair, for Kierkegaard, is what happens when that project fails. Not catastrophically, not in a single dramatic collapse, but quietly, when the self stops moving toward what it is meant to be. When it stalls, or turns away, or simply runs out of the energy to keep trying. And the remarkable thing about his definition, the thing that makes it useful at midnight, lying in bed feeling flat and directionless, is that despair, in his sense, is not the opposite of happiness. It is the opposite of faith. And by faith, he did not primarily mean religious belief. He meant a certain kind of grounding, a certain quality of relationship between the self and whatever gives the self its ground. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the breath move. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that is not tiredness. It is the exhaustion of someone who has been holding a version of themselves in place for so long that they can no longer remember why. The performance of competence, of certainty, of knowing what they want and where they are going. And at some point, usually in the dark, usually when the day has finally let them go, the performance stops, and what remains is the feeling we are talking about tonight. Kierkegaard would not call this breakdown, he would call it proximity. You are, in his terms, close to the actual question. The performance was the thing keeping you from it. The 3 stages of existence he mapped, which we will walk through in the next several hours, are not a ladder to climb. They are a map of the different ways a self can fail to become itself. And most of us, he thought, spend our lives in one of the first 2, wondering why we cannot quite arrive. Tonight we trace all 3. There is a quieter layer beneath that. We are moving toward it now. Let the body settle. Let the jaw soften. We are still near the beginning. In 1838, Michael Kierkegaard died. He was 82 years old. He had lived to see almost everyone he loved die before him. He had told Soren the secret, the curse, the hill, the curse of God, and Soren had received it with the strange gratitude of a person who needed to understand why the weight had always been there. Within the year, Soren Kierkegaard had finished his theology degree. He was 26 years old, brilliant, isolated, and carrying two things: his father's guilt and his own questions about what a human life is supposed to be. He was about to fall in love. That story comes next. Chapter 4. What the first stage actually feels like. Before the love story, we need the first stage. Kierkegaard called it the aesthetic stage. The word comes from the Greek aesthesis, sensation, feeling, the raw experience of the world. The aesthetic stage is the stage of immediate experience. The person in this stage lives for what feels good, for pleasure, novelty, sensation, beauty, excitement. They move from one thing to the next, seeking the next thing that will satisfy, the next feeling that will fill the hollow. This is not a judgment. Kierkegaard was not moralizing, he was describing. And what he described is something almost everyone recognizes in themselves at some level. Think of the person who collects experiences the way others collect objects. The weekend that was supposed to be perfect. The relationship that was supposed to complete something. The achievement that was supposed to feel like enough. The aesthetic person lives in pursuit of the next high note, the moment of beauty, pleasure, or excitement that will finally satisfy the hunger that drives them. The trouble is that it never quite does. Not permanently. The great description of the aesthetic stage in Kierkegaard's work comes in Either or, published in 1843. He wrote the book under a pseudonym, A, the aesthetic voice, and gave him the most beautiful, tortured, intelligent prose he could manage. A writes a seducer's diary. He writes essays on boredom. He writes about music and Mozart and the way Don Juan moves through the world, never stopping, always desiring, always moving on, because stopping would mean feeling the emptiness behind the desire. Don Juan is the archetype of the aesthetic stage, not because he is immoral, but because he has made desire itself into a way of life. Beauty is his only standard. The moment of conquest is his only currency. And he must keep moving, because the moment he stops, the silence arrives. Let your breath move. Nothing you hear tonight requires anything of you. The silence that the aesthetic person fears is the silence we are in right now. This one, the ordinary silence of a room at midnight, when the body has stopped performing and the day is gone, and there is no new sensation to chase. Kierkegaard was not describing a villain. He was describing a way that intelligent, sensitive people organize their lives when they have not yet found a different foundation. The aesthetic stage has its own beauty. Don Juan is genuinely charming. The seducer in Either or is a brilliant writer. The problem is not that they love beauty. The problem is that they have made beauty their only ground. And at some point, usually quietly, usually in a season when the pleasures that used to satisfy have begun to feel a little flat, the aesthetic stage reveals its limitation. The flatness arrives. Nothing new calls quite as loudly as it used to. The next experience does not quite deliver what the last one promised. And there is a kind of boredom that settles in, not ordinary boredom, but the deeper kind. The boredom of a person who has exhausted their own formula. That boredom is not meaningless. Kierkegaard thought it was a doorway. But we will come back to that. Let the shoulders drop. Let the chest soften. We carry this forward. Chapter 5, Copenhagen, 1841. The engagement. It was the autumn of 1840. Kierkegaard was 27 years old, recently finished with his university degree and living in Copenhagen with his brother. He had been visiting the Olsen household for several years. The family were friends of friends, the kind of middle-class Copenhagen connection that organized a young man's social life. Regine Olsen was 18. He proposed to her. She said yes, and then he spent the next year unable to explain to himself or anyone else why he had done it and whether he should undo it. The story of Kierkegaard and Regine is one of the most analyzed relationships in the history of philosophy, mostly because Kierkegaard could not stop writing about it. He never used her name directly. He wrote about her through pseudonyms, through philosophy, through characters in his book. He spent years examining what had happened between them from every possible angle. The aesthete who falls in love, the ethical man who must honor his commitments, the question of whether love is compatible with becoming oneself. What happened, as best as anyone can reconstruct it, Kierkegaard broke off the engagement in 1841. He returned Regine's ring. She reportedly asked if he would ever marry her. He said no. She went to the window and stood there for a long time. She eventually married someone else. She outlived Kierkegaard by nearly 50 years. By all accounts, she was happy. Feel the weight of the pillow. The room is still. Kierkegaard never fully explained his reasons for ending the engagement, even to himself. His journals circle the question repeatedly. Some possibilities he entertained. That he was too melancholy to offer another person a real life. That his relationship to his father's guilt had made him unfit for ordinary happiness. That the engagement was an aesthetic move, a beautiful desire that collided with the ethical reality of what commitment actually requires. That he needed to be free to do his work. The charitable reading, and perhaps the most honest one, is this. Kierkegaard was standing at the doorway between the first stage and the second. He had desired Regine with the full force of an aesthetic personality. He loved her beauty. He loved the idea of loving her. And when it came time to commit to the ongoing, unglamorous, demanding reality of what love actually is, he found that he did not know how. He spent the next 15 years writing books that were, in some sense, about learning how. Fear and Trembling, published 2 years after the broken engagement, contains his most sustained meditation on what it means to make a genuine commitment to something you cannot rationally justify. He used Abraham as his model. He used himself as his problem. We are walking toward fear and trembling. But first, the second stage. Let the breath move on its own. We continue. Chapter 6, the second stage. Choosing to commit. If the aesthetic stage is about living for what feels good, the ethical stage is about something harder and, in many ways, more admirable. It is about living for what is right. The person in the ethical stage does not drift from pleasure to pleasure. They have made commitments. They have accepted obligations. They show up day after day for the people and the duties they have taken on. They are, in the old word, honorable. Kierkegaard's archetype for the ethical stage is Judge William, another pseudonym, another voice, in Either or. He is a married man, a civic official, a figure of upright character and genuine affection for his wife. He writes long letters to the aesthete A, urging him to choose, to stop floating, and to commit to something. The act of choosing, Judge William argues, is what makes a person, and he is right as far as he goes. The ethical stage is genuinely better than the aesthetic stage. It has depth, continuity, relationship, responsibility. The person in the ethical stage has learned something the aesthete has not, that life requires commitments, and commitments require the willingness to be held to account for them. Let your jaw soften. Your body is heavy where it rests. But Kierkegaard thought the ethical stage has its own limitation. And the limitation is this: the ethical stage is still, in the end, a human construction. It is built on duty, on social expectation, on the idea that if you fulfill your obligations, you will be whole. And for many people, for a long time, that works. They find in marriage, in work, in community, in the daily practice of showing up, a sustaining ground. But for some people, and perhaps for everyone at certain moments, the ethical stage also runs dry. Not because they have abandoned their commitments, they have kept them, but because keeping commitments alone, without any deeper ground beneath the keeping, eventually produces a kind of hollow competence. The person who does everything right and still lies awake at midnight wondering what it was all for. This is not a crisis of morality, it is a philosophical crisis. The ethical framework has reached its own ceiling. And Kierkegaard's claim, radical in his time, still unsettling now, is that the ethical stage, no matter how faithfully lived, cannot by itself produce the wholeness it promises. Because wholeness is not an achievement. It cannot be earned by accumulating good choices. It requires a different kind of move entirely. He called that move the leap. We will arrive there. But first, we need the fullest possible picture of why the leap is necessary. The picture lives in his most difficult book, published in 1849, a book he wrote under the pseudonym Anticlimacus and called The Sickness unto Death. That title is a quotation from the Gospel of John. It is the chapter in which Jesus hears that his friend Lazarus is dying and says, "This sickness is not unto death," and then Lazarus dies. The point of the quotation is not hope. The point is that there is something worse than death. And Kierkegaard's name for that thing is despair. We are moving toward that book. But before we arrive there, we go back to 1843 and the book that changed everything. Feel the weight of the bed beneath you. Nothing here is urgent. The body is settling. The mind can follow. Chapter 7, Fear and Trembling. Copenhagen. Kierkegaard publishes 2 books on the same day. One is called Repetition. The other is called Fear and Trembling. Both are written under pseudonyms. Both circle the same question from different angles. What does it mean to make a genuine commitment when you cannot be certain it is right? Fear and Trembling is written by Johannes de Silentio, John of Silence. It is a meditation on a single story from the book of Genesis. Abraham, Mount Moriah. The knife. You know the story, or the outline of it. God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac, his only son, the son of the promise, the child he had waited his entire life for, to the mountain and sacrifice him. Abraham obeys. He travels 3 days to the mountain with Isaac. He binds his son on the altar. He raises the knife. And at the last moment, an angel stops him and a ram is provided in Isaac's place. The ordinary reading of this story is about faith and obedience. Kierkegaard's reading is stranger and more uncomfortable than that. He asks, what was Abraham feeling on those 3 days of walking? Not the religious interpretation, not the theological conclusion, but the actual experience. What was it like to walk for 3 days toward an act you cannot explain, cannot justify, cannot make morally acceptable by any standard of ethics? Because by any ethical standard, what Abraham was about to do is murder. There is no ethical framework that permits a father to kill his son. And yet Abraham went, not with the cheerful certainty of a man who has worked out the math, with silence, with a trust that had no rational foundation. Let the breath move, let the body settle. Johannes de Silentio identifies what he calls the night of infinite resignation. This is the person who has given up everything, who has accepted that what they love most may be taken from them, and who has made peace with that loss. This is admirable. It is the Stoics' achievement, the acceptance of limitation. But Abraham, Kierkegaard argues, is not the night of infinite resignation. Abraham makes the infinite resignation and something beyond it. He gives up Isaac completely, and then he does not stay in the resignation. He goes forward believing, against all logic, that Isaac will be returned to him. He holds the loss and the return simultaneously. He takes the step toward the knife while somehow expecting the ram. This is what Kierkegaard calls the leap of faith. It is not a comfortable concept. It is not a move that can be reasoned into. The night of faith, Abraham, walking to Mount Moriah, looks from the outside exactly like an ordinary person. He is not ecstatic. He is not performing certainty. He is walking step by step, holding two irreconcilable things at once. And this is the move, Kierkegaard argues, that neither the aesthetic stage nor the ethical stage can produce, because it requires something neither stage can supply, a ground that is not self-generated. We carry this forward. The body is heavy. The room is still. We continue. Chapter 8, The Night of Faith. What does the night of faith look like from the outside? Kierkegaard's answer is deliberately, even comically, ordinary. He looks like a local businessman. He walks with a normal gait. He takes pleasure in food. in his wife, in the small satisfactions of his day. He does not have the anguished face of a person carrying an infinite burden. He does not radiate spiritual achievement. He is, from the outside, indistinguishable from any other middle-aged man going about his affairs. This is not an accident. Kierkegaard's point is that the third stage, the religious stage, the stage of faith, does not remove a person from ordinary life. It returns them to ordinary life from the inside out. The person who has made the leap does not transcend the world. They receive it back. Think of the difference between carrying your life as a burden and inhabiting it as a gift. Not a gift you feel you deserve, not a gift you have earned. Just the daily, modest, renewed willingness to be here, in this specific body, in this specific set of circumstances, without needing them to be different than they are. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of the bed. The reason this is a stage and not a trick is that it comes at the end of a journey. You cannot leap to faith from the aesthetic stage. The aesthetic person has not yet been serious enough about anything to know what giving it up would cost. The leap requires the full weight of what is at stake. You have to have loved something and offered it and gone forward anyway. Abraham had waited 100 years for Isaac. He loved his son with everything he had. That is why the story is about him and not about someone who had less to lose. The knight of faith has loved something completely and then held it open, not with the forced cheerfulness of someone performing peace, with the quiet, paradoxical confidence of someone who has given up, requiring the outcome in advance. This sounds, when you describe it, like something very far away from the ordinary midnight feeling of flatness and lost meaning. But Kierkegaard's whole project rests on the claim that it is not far away at all. It is what the flatness is pointed toward. The exhaustion of the aesthetic stage, the hollow competence of the ethical stage, the midnight feeling that none of it has been enough, these are not malfunctions. They are the approach of the question that the third stage answers. And here is a quieter layer beneath that. The flatness you feel at midnight is not evidence that you have failed. It is evidence that you are serious enough about your life to know that something is missing. The body knows this before the mind does. Let the jaw soften. We are moving into the deepening hours now. The next set of chapters carries us into the most difficult and most useful of Kierkegaard's books. Let the breath move. The room is still. Chapter 9. What Kierkegaard saw in Hegel. Before we can fully understand why Kierkegaard thought the third stage was necessary, we need to understand what he was arguing against. The dominant philosophy of Kierkegaard's Europe was the work of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who had died in 1831, 2 years before Kierkegaard began publishing. Hegel's project was enormous, perhaps the most ambitious philosophical system ever constructed. He argued that history is the unfolding of absolute spirit, that everything that happens is part of a rational progression, that reality itself is fundamentally rational, and that the purpose of philosophy is to comprehend this rationality from within. The appeal of this view was immense. If everything that happens is part of a rational system, then everything can in principle be understood. Suffering has a place, history has a direction. The individual has a role in something larger than themselves. The system offers, in a word, comfort. Kierkegaard despised it. Not because it was wrong about everything, but because it left out the thing that mattered most to him, the individual, the single human life. The person lying awake at night who cannot be comforted by a system, because systems do not lie awake at night, and systems do not feel the particular weight of a particular existence. Let your breath move. Nothing here is abstract. We are still in the room. Kierkegaard's famous objection to Hegel runs something like this. Hegel builds a magnificent palace of thought and then lives outside it. The system comprehends everything except the experience of being the one who built it. It is philosophy from nowhere, describing everywhere except the specific somewhere that each person actually inhabits. Kierkegaard wanted philosophy from somewhere. He wanted philosophy that started with the irreducible fact of the individual, the single person, with a particular history, a particular guilt, a particular love, a particular set of questions that no system could dissolve. He used the ancient Athenian Socrates as his countermodel. Socrates had not built a system. Socrates had walked around Athens asking people what they meant by what they said and revealing, with quiet patience, that they did not quite know. Socrates did not offer answers. He created the space in which genuine questions could be recognized as genuine. Aristotle had noted that philosophy begins in wonder. Kierkegaard thought that Hegel had replaced wonder with comprehension, had traded the genuine question for the impressive answer, and in doing so had eliminated the one thing that makes philosophy live, the encounter with what you do not yet know. The person who has lost the meaning in everything is standing in that encounter. They are at the edge of the system, in the silence the system cannot fill. This is not a catastrophe, it is a beginning. Let the shoulders drop. The body is heavy and still. We continue deeper. Chapter 10, The Concept of Anxiety. In 1844, Soren Kierkegaard published a book under the pseudonym Vigilius Haufniensis, the Watchman of Copenhagen. He called it The Concept of Anxiety. It contains the sentence that is probably his most famous: anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Let that sentence sit for a moment before we unpack it. The anxiety he is describing is not what we usually mean by the word. It is not the hammering heart before a presentation. It is not the fear of specific bad outcomes. Fear has an object, Kierkegaard notes carefully. You fear the dog, the darkness, the diagnosis. But anxiety is different. Anxiety has no object. It is not about anything specific. It is a diffuse, hovering unease, the feeling that something is wrong without knowing what. And Kierkegaard's claim is that this objectless anxiety is what freedom feels like. Think about what freedom actually means. It means that you could, in principle, do otherwise. That the next moment is not fully determined by the last one. That you are, in a genuine sense, responsible for what you choose. This is what makes human life different from the life of a stone, or a reflex, or a habit. The space of possibility. but possibility is vertiginous. If you could do otherwise, if the next moment is genuinely open, then you are standing at an edge, not an edge over which you will fall, an edge of infinite openness. And infinite openness is, for a creature with a finite life and finite understanding, terrifying. Feel the weight of the bed. Let the breath move on its own. The person who lies awake at midnight, unable to quite name what is wrong, is very often experiencing this specific anxiety. Not the fear of any particular outcome, the vertigo of having more choice than they know what to do with, combined with the suspicion that the choices they have made so far have not quite landed where they were supposed to. Kierkegaard thought this was entirely reasonable. He did not think anxiety was a malfunction. He thought it was the appropriate response to being a finite creature with infinite possibility. The problem is not that you feel anxious. The problem is what you do with the anxiety. The aesthetic response is to flee it into the next experience, the next novelty, the next pleasure that will temporarily quiet the dizziness. The ethical response is to organize it, to fill the freedom with duty until the vertigo recedes. Both of these work for a while, but the anxiety remains. It surfaces reliably in the quiet hours, in rooms exactly like this one. Kierkegaard thought that anxiety, properly received, not fled and not organized away, but sat with, points towards something. The dizziness of freedom is unpleasant, but it is real. And it is honest in a way that most of our daily activities are not. Here is the small detail that changes it. The anxiety is not the enemy of the meaning you are looking for. It is the closest you can come to the question the meaning is the answer to. Let your jaw soften. The body is settling. We move forward. Chapter 11. The Journals. Between the published books and the philosophical pseudonyms, between the breakup with Regine and the attack on the church that would consume his last year, Kierkegaard kept a journal. Not a polished journal. Not a document prepared for posterity. A working journal. Thousands of pages written in a spidery hand, filled with drafts and abandoned arguments and sudden moments of clarity that did not end up in any book. He kept it from the age of 22 until the year he died. There is an entry from 1835, he was 22, still a student, that people who study him often quote because it sounds so utterly unlike a philosophical proposition. He wrote, "What I truly need is to get clear about what I must do, not what I must know, except insofar as a certain understanding must precede every action. The thing is to understand myself, to see what God really wishes me to do. The thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea for which I can live and die." He was 22. He had the whole architecture of his thought still ahead of him. But the question was already there. Not what is true in the abstract, but what is true for me. Not what the system says, but what my own life requires. Let the breath move. Let the shoulders drop. This is the core of what he meant by subjectivity. Not subjectivism, Not the idea that truth is whatever you feel it is, but something harder and more demanding. That truth must be appropriated. It must be taken in and lived from. A truth you know but do not live is not quite truth yet. It is information. The journals reveal a man who was applying this standard to himself with unusual rigor. He examined his own motives, his own evasions, his own habits of thought. He asked himself repeatedly whether he was living as if he believed what he said he believed. He often concluded that he was not. This is not a confession of failure. It is the practice of philosophical honesty. The willingness to look at the gap between what you claim to value and how you actually live, and to hold that gap as a question rather than resolving it too quickly with an excuse or a justification. The person who lies awake at midnight, the person this video is for, the person who has lost the meaning in everything, is often doing exactly this without knowing it. They are holding the gap. They have stopped being able to pretend the gap is smaller than it is. Kierkegaard would recognize this immediately. He would call it a form of seriousness. Not comfortable seriousness, but real. The journals are full of seriousness of this kind. A man asking himself the question again, the same question in different forms, across 40 years of notebooks. What must I do? What is true for me? What does it mean that I am here? He never found a final answer. He found better questions. That is what we are doing tonight. The body is settling. Nothing presses. We continue. Chapter 12, The Pseudonyms. One of the strangest things about Kierkegaard's work is that much of it was not published under his own name. He invented a gallery of authors: Johannes de Silentio, who wrote Fear and Trembling; Victor Eremita, the hermit Victor, who edited Either Or; Constantin Constantius, who wrote Repetition; Vigilius Haufniensis, the watchman of Copenhagen, who wrote The Concept of Anxiety; Anticlimacus, the most demanding of them all, who wrote The Sickness unto Death. Each pseudonym had a distinct voice, a distinct philosophical position, a distinct personality. They were not thin disguises. They were genuinely different perspectives, each one exploring a particular part of the human situation from inside that position. Kierkegaard's explanation, given in a short, almost comically modest appendix he appended to the collected pseudonymous works, was that he had written indirectly because direct communication of existential truth is impossible. You cannot hand someone the truth about their own existence. If they receive it, they will receive it as information, not as understanding. Understanding requires that the reader do the work themselves. The pseudonyms create a kind of distance. The reader encounters a perspective, engages with it, argues with it, or recognizes themselves in it, and, in doing so, does the actual philosophical work. The author recedes, the reader does the thinking. Let your jaw soften. Feel the breath move. This is the same reason Socrates asked questions instead of delivering answers. The question creates the space. The answer closes it. Kierkegaard was, in this sense, a Socratic teacher, except that instead of questions, he used characters. He created a seducer, a judge, a silently walking man on the road to Moriah, a watchman of the city, an anticlimactic saint. And through these figures, he explored what it actually feels like to inhabit each stage of existence from the inside. The pseudonymous method is also, if you think about it, a form of honesty. A single voice proclaiming the truth of the three stages would itself contradict the message. That truth must be appropriated by each person individually. So Kierkegaard gave you multiple voices, each one internally consistent, none of them claiming the view from nowhere. And somewhere between them, if you do the work, you find your own position. There is something in this method that speaks directly to the person lying in the dark, trying to figure out what they actually believe. Not what they were told, not what the system says. What they actually believe when the performances have stopped and the night has quieted everything else down. Kierkegaard thought that was the only question worth asking. Anticlimacus, his most demanding pseudonym, was his most severe. The name means below the climax, or in the shadow of the highest point. It suggests someone who can see the peak more clearly than anyone else, and who knows the distance between where they are and where the peak is. Anticlimacus wrote The Sickness unto Death. We are moving toward that book now. Let the shoulders drop, let the body be heavy. We continue into the second hour. Chapter 13, The Sickness unto Death begins. Re-engagement. If your mind has been drifting, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. It is 1849. Kierkegaard is 36 years old. He has been publishing for 6 years, a torrent of books, most of them pseudonymous, most of them received with puzzlement or indifference by the Copenhagen public. He is not famous, he is not celebrated. He has spent his inheritance on publication costs. He lives alone, and he writes under the name Anticlimacus, the most difficult and most important of all his books. He calls it The Sickness unto Death, a Christian psychological exposition for edification and awakening. The title is taken from the Gospel of John, as we noted. When Jesus hears that Lazarus is sick, he says, "This sickness is not unto death." And then Lazarus dies. And then Jesus raises him. Kierkegaard's point is not the resurrection. His point is the phrase that comes before the resurrection. This sickness is not unto death. What Kierkegaard wants to say is that there is a sickness that is, in his sense, unto death. Not physical death, not even psychological death in the clinical sense, but a form of dying that does not end, a condition that is worse than dying because it goes on. That sickness is despair. Let your breath move. Feel the weight of the bed. The opening of The Sickness unto Death is one of the most compressed, difficult passages in all of Western philosophy. Kierkegaard, as Anticlimacus, defines the self as a relation that relates itself to itself. The self is not a substance, it is not a thing. It is a dynamic relationship between what you are and what you are becoming, between the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, the given and the chosen. Most readers encounter this definition and feel their eyes skid across it. It sounds like technical jargon, but here is what it means, slowly. You are not simply what you are at this moment. You are also what you could be. You are the relationship between what you have been given, your body, your history, your circumstances, and what you do with what you have been given. The self is not the given alone, and it is not the chosen alone. It is the ongoing relationship between them. And despair is what happens when that relationship breaks down. When the given and the chosen stop working together. When the self stops moving toward what it is meant to become. There is a quieter layer beneath that. We move toward it now. The self that cannot become itself is not a dramatic failure. It is usually quiet. It looks from the outside like a person who is fine, who goes to work and comes home and eats and sleeps and manages, but inside the movement has stopped. The self is holding itself still, and the stillness, which looks like peace, is actually a kind of paralysis. Kierkegaard's term for this paralysis, this failure of the self to become itself, is despair, and his central claim is that most people are in it. Most people, most of the time, are in some form of despair and do not know it, because they do not have a word for the condition, and because despair, in his sense, does not announce itself with drama. It announces itself as flatness, as the quiet feeling that the meaning has gone out of things. We continue. Chapter 14. Not wanting to be yourself. The first kind of despair. Kierkegaard names it in The Sickness Unto Death, with the precision of someone who has spent years observing both himself and the people around him. He calls it not wanting to be oneself. This is not as simple as it sounds. Not wanting to be yourself does not primarily mean wishing you had a different face, or a different job, or a different life history, though it can include those things. It means something deeper. The refusal to accept the self that you are as the material you have to work with. The persistent fantasy that you are, in some essential way, the wrong person. That someone else with a different nature, a different past, a different set of possibilities would be able to do the thing you are here to do. The person in this form of despair may not experience it as despair at all. They experience it as dissatisfaction, as a sense of having been given the wrong equipment, as a tiredness that is not quite tiredness, more like a low-level argument they are always having with the basic facts of their existence. They are ambitious, often. They work hard. They are trying, genuinely, to build the self they believe they should be. But there is a desperation in the trying, a quality of running away from something as much as running toward it. The self they are building is always slightly elsewhere, slightly ahead, always the self that will finally be acceptable. Let the shoulders drop. Nothing here asks anything of you. Kierkegaard thought this form of despair was extremely common. He also thought it was partially rooted in something real, the aesthetic stage's legacy. The person who has spent their life in the aesthetic stage has been moving away from the given, away from the ordinary facts of their existence, toward the next pleasure, the next novelty, the next thing that promises relief. When they arrive at the point of crisis, the midnight hour, when the pleasures have run thin, what they find is a self they have never quite inhabited. They do not want to be themselves because they do not really know who that is. There is something difficult and clarifying in this. The dissatisfaction is not wrong. The sense that something is missing is not wrong. But the direction it is being pointed, outward, toward the fantasy self, toward the life that should have been, is not the direction of resolution. Resolution, for Kierkegaard, involves a movement inward. Not inward in the sense of navel-gazing or self-obsession. Inward in the sense of receiving your own life as the actual material. This body, this history, this set of relationships, this particular arrangement of gifts and limitations, not as a consolation prize, as the thing itself. The second kind of despair is different, and in some ways harder. We arrive there next. Feel the breath move. The body is settling. We continue. Chapter 15. Wanting to be yourself on your own terms. The second kind of despair is, in some ways, more interesting and more difficult than the first. Kierkegaard calls it willing to be oneself, but on one's own terms. The person in this form of despair has moved past the first kind. They are not running from themselves. They have faced themselves, more or less. They have some real sense of who they are and what they are made of. They have stopped fantasizing about being someone else. But they insist on being who they are without any ground beyond their own will. They have claimed their identity fully, but they have claimed it as a kind of absolute self-sufficiency. They do not need anyone. They do not need anything beyond themselves. They have decided that what they are is what they are, and that is enough. And they will not be dependent on anything outside that closed circle. This is a recognizable human type, not a villain, often admirable in many ways. The person who has built their life on their own terms, through their own effort, without leaning on anyone. The person who says, I did this myself, I owe nothing to anyone, I am what I made myself. Kierkegaard had enormous respect for this kind of person in some ways. The strength, the refusal of easy comfort, the genuine achievement of self-sufficiency, these are real things. Let your jaw soften. Feel the weight of the bed. But he also thought this form of despair was a form of pride that eventually eats itself. The self that insists on its own absolute self-sufficiency is the self that has refused to acknowledge its own finitude. The self that refuses dependency is the self that cannot receive anything, cannot receive help, cannot receive love in its full weight, cannot receive the ordinary gift of being finite and alive in a world it did not create. And at some point, usually late, usually quietly, this self-sufficiency becomes exhausting. Not because the person has failed, often they have succeeded, but the success feels hollow in a particular way. the way that anything feels hollow when there is no one else in the room with you who has been fully let in. The person in this second despair has everything they built for themselves. They are what they said they would be, and they lie awake at midnight wondering why it is not enough. Kierkegaard's answer is not what most people expect. He does not say, get more. He does not say, you need relationships, go find some. He says something stranger and more precise. The self that insists on absolute self-sufficiency has misunderstood what the self is. The self is not a closed system. It is a relation, and relations require two parties. The self requires a ground beyond itself in order to become itself. What that ground is, he will tell us in The Sickness unto Death's final turn. We are not there yet. The body is heavy, the night is quiet. We continue. Chapter 16. The night he understood his father. Let your shoulders drop. We are in the second hour now. If your mind has been wandering, come back gently. The next part matters. It is sometime in the late 1830s. Kierkegaard's father, Michael, is in his early 80s. He has been ill. He has been sitting with his guilt for the better part of 6 decades. And he decides finally to tell his son. We do not know exactly what he said. The journals are indirect, but the weight of it is clear enough. Michael Kierkegaard told his son the story of the hill in Jutland, the curse on the cold heath. The young boy's anger at God, the years of punishment that followed, the deaths, the losses, the guilt that never receded. He told his son that he believed the family was cursed. Soren received this information at the age of approximately 25. He had already been carrying something, the atmospheric heaviness of the house, the sense that his father was holding something he could not quite see. Now he had the name for it. The effect was not what you might expect. It was not primarily grief, or anger, or horror. It was, according to the journals, more like recognition. Here was the name for the weight he had grown up inside. Here was the guilt that had shaped everything. The religious severity, the learning, the private anguish, the sense that ordinary happiness was not quite available. Feel the breath move. The room is still. What is remarkable is what Kierkegaard did with this information. He did not abandon his father. He did not rewrite his childhood as a trauma. He continued to love Michael Kierkegaard with a complicated, serious love, and he absorbed the story as a philosophical problem. Here it is. What does it mean to inherit guilt? What does it mean to be shaped by something you did not choose? A father's sin, a family's curse, a history that arrived before you were old enough to consent to it? How does the self become itself when the material it is given has already been marked by someone else's despair? These questions run through everything Kierkegaard wrote after his father's death. The concept of anxiety, with its account of original sin as an inherited anxiety that each person must individually appropriate. The sickness unto death, with its careful map of how despair passes from generation to generation without anyone intending it. Fear and Trembling, with its meditation on what it means to carry forward a commitment you did not originally make. The father's story is not incidental to the philosophy. It is the wound that made the philosophy necessary. And there is something in this that speaks to the person lying in the dark who cannot quite name where their own weight comes from. Not everything that presses on you at midnight is yours. Some of it is inherited. Some of it was placed in you before you had the language to receive it consciously. Kierkegaard thought the work of becoming oneself necessarily involved receiving the inherited weight clearly, not as a destiny, as material. The given that you then must choose what to do with. The body is heavy and still. The night continues. Chapter 17 to 3 thinkers who sat with this before him. Kierkegaard did not invent the problem of despair. He named it more precisely than anyone had, but the experience he was describing had been recognized before him, and knowing his predecessors gives the problem its full weight. The first is Augustine of Hippo, born 354 AD in what is now Algeria. A brilliant, sensuous, restless man who spent the first 30 years of his life looking for a satisfaction that each new pleasure promised but none delivered. He was an aesthete in Kierkegaard's sense, educated, urban, pleasure-loving, moving from philosophy to philosophy, from city to city, from lover to lover. He had a child out of wedlock. He was, in his own description, torn, and then, in a garden in Milan, in 386 AD, something shifted. He describes it in the Confessions with a precision that has lasted 16 centuries. A voice, the words, "Take up and read," a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans, and something giving way inside him. He had a word for what he had been feeling all along. Our heart is restless until it rests in you. The restlessness, the aesthetic exhaustion, the ethical insufficiency was not random. It had a shape. It was pointing toward something. Kierkegaard read Augustine carefully. He recognized the structure of the argument. The exhaustion of the lower stages is not an accident. It is a signal. Let the breath move. Feel the weight of the bed. The second thinker is Blaise Pascal, born 1623 in Clermont-Ferrand, France. A mathematician of the first rank, he invented a calculating machine at 19, made foundational contributions to probability theory and fluid dynamics. And alongside the mathematics, he wrote one of the most penetrating psychological documents in the Western tradition, the Pensées, the Thoughts, a collection of fragments assembled after his death. The fragment we carry tonight, all of humanity's problems, stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Pascal wrote this in the 1650s. He meant it precisely. The inability to sit with oneself, to remain present to one's own existence without being distracted, is the root of all the pursuits that promise relief and deliver only more noise. The pursuit of novelty, of entertainment, of work, of achievement, all of them ways of avoiding the silence in which the actual question lives. Pascal's word for the avoidance was diversion, and like Augustine's restlessness, the diversion is not a random failure, it is the sign of something that has not yet been found. And the third, Dostoevsky. Born 1821, 5 years before Kierkegaard published his first book. They were reading the same European intellectual climate, arriving at related conclusions by different routes. Dostoevsky's Underground Man, the narrator of Notes from Underground, published in 1864, is perhaps the most precise fictional portrait of the second form of despair. The man who insists on being himself on his own terms, who refuses every system, every comfort, every ground that he did not choose, and who exhausts himself in the insisting. These three voices, Augustine, Pascal, Dostoevsky, circle the same territory from different angles. The territory is this: the self that cannot quite be satisfied by anything it finds, because what it needs is something it has not yet had the courage to look for directly. The room is still. We continue. Chapter 18, Repetition. In 1843, on the same day he published Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard published a stranger, shorter book called Repetition. He wrote it under the pseudonym Constantin Constantius. The title sounds unpromising. Repetition suggests routine, the deadening return of the same thing, the opposite of novelty. But Kierkegaard meant something opposite to deadening. He was distinguishing between two movements of the soul. The first is recollection, looking backward, toward the past, toward what was. The Greeks valued recollection highly, knowledge as the recovery of what the soul already knows. Plato's theory of learning as remembering, the life spent in nostalgia for what has been. Kierkegaard thought recollection was insufficient. If the self is always looking backward, it is not becoming itself. It is only recovering what was. And what was is not the same as what is meant to be. Repetition is different. Repetition is the forward movement, the act of receiving back in the present what you thought had been lost, not as a memory, but as a reality. Let the breath move. Let the jaw soften. He takes the example of a man who revisits a place he loved in his youth, a theatre, a cafe, a city, expecting to find the feeling he had there before. And he finds, of course, that the feeling is gone. The place is the same, the memory is vivid, but the experience is flat. This is the failure of recollection as a strategy for meaning. You cannot recover what was by returning to its external form. The past cannot be restored by repetition in the ordinary sense. But there is another kind of repetition. It comes not from looking backward, but from moving forward with the willingness to receive something again, not the same thing, but something, with the fullness of attention you gave to the first time. The person who has lost the meaning in everything has, in some sense, stopped believing that repetition in this second sense is possible. They have concluded, usually without knowing it, that the meanings they once had are gone and that nothing new will replace them, that the forward direction holds nothing worth receiving. Kierkegaard thought this conclusion was always premature, not because the old meanings would return, they rarely do, but because the self that is genuinely available to receive something new is different from the self that has given up expecting it. There is something here that is very close to the experience of falling asleep itself. You cannot force sleep by trying harder. You cannot recollect your way back to the ease of childhood sleep. But you can stop fighting. You can become available. And in the availability, something arrives. This is repetition in Kierkegaard's sense. Not the return of the old, the reception of the new in the same spirit that received the old. The body knows how to do this. It is the mind that resists. Let the shoulders drop. Let the body settle. We continue. Chapter 19, The Single Individual. Against Hegel's universal system, against the comfort of the crowd, against the idea that meaning comes from belonging to a collective movement, a historical force, an institutional faith. Kierkegaard's central commitment, the one that runs through all the pseudonyms and all the stages, is to the single individual. He used the Danish word enkelte with a deliberateness that his translators sometimes struggle to preserve. The single individual, not the isolated individual, cut off and alone, but the irreducible individual, the person who cannot be dissolved into a crowd or a system or a role without losing the thing that makes them a self in the first place. The crowd, for Kierkegaard, is where conscience goes to die. In the crowd, no one is responsible for anything. Every crowd member can point to the crowd as the author of its decisions. The crowd marches, riots, votes, believes, and no single person inside it has made a genuine choice. They have been carried. This is not a conservative political argument. Kierkegaard was not arguing for individualism in the modern sense. He was making a philosophical point that ethical life, the kind of life that actually means something, is only possible for the person who accepts that they are responsible, who accepts that they cannot delegate their existence to a system. Let the breath move. Let the chest soften. This is the point at which his work speaks most directly to the person lying in the dark. Because the feeling of having lost the meaning is, at its core, the feeling of having lost the thread of one's own singular existence, of having spent a long time in a crowd of expectations, of roles, of performances, and finding in the quiet that the thread is harder to locate than expected. The single individual is not someone who has solved this problem. They are someone who has accepted that the problem is theirs, that no one else can locate the thread for them, that the responsibility for becoming oneself is, in the end, non-transferable. This is both the hardest thing, Kierkegaard says, and the most honest. He was writing always about the person who accepts this responsibility and then has to figure out what to do with it. The 3 stages are not a curriculum. They are a description of how people actually organize their lives in the face of the responsibility, how they manage it, and where each management strategy eventually fails. The aesthetic person delegates to sensation, the ethical person delegates to duty. The 3rd stage is the person who accepts the responsibility fully and then asks, what ground am I standing on if I am not standing on pleasure and I am not standing on duty? That ground is the question the 3rd stage answers. We are moving toward it. Grounding. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The breath moves on its own. Nothing you carry into this night needs to be resolved by morning. Chapter 20. Works of Love. In 1847, Kierkegaard published one of the most unusual books in the entire history of philosophy. He called it Works of Love. He published it under his own name, not a pseudonym. It was a deliberate break from the indirect method. The book is about love. But Kierkegaard's account of love is not what most people expect. He begins with a distinction. There are what he calls preferential loves, the love you feel for your family, your friends, the people who are near to you by blood or habit or temperament. These are real, they are not wrong. But they are partial. They are loves that flow from the self outward toward particular people who happen to be close. They are, in this sense, extensions of the self. And then there is what he calls Christian love, the love of the neighbor. Not the neighbor in the sense of the person next door, specifically. The neighbor in the sense of any person you encounter who requires something from you. The stranger on the road, the person in the waiting room, the person you do not know and have no particular reason to prefer. Kierkegaard argues that this love, the love of the neighbor, is the most demanding love possible, and it is more demanding precisely because it is not rooted in preference. You cannot love the neighbor because the neighbor is attractive or useful or interesting or similar to you. You love the neighbor because they are there. Let your jaw soften. The room is still. This sounds austere. But Kierkegaard's point is more subtle than mere self-denial. The love of the neighbor is the love that does not require a return. It is the love that does not keep accounts, that does not love in order to be loved, does not give in order to receive, does not seek recognition for its giving. This kind of love is, paradoxically, the only love that does not eventually exhaust itself. The preferential loves, the loves rooted in what the beloved gives back to you, are always subject to the exhaustion of the aesthetic stage. They depend on the beloved being what they were when you first loved them, on the relationship continuing to deliver the feeling it originally delivered. And feelings change. People change. The preferential loves carry within themselves the seed of their own disappointment. The love of the neighbor, because it does not require a particular return, does not run dry in the same way. There is something in this that connects directly to the person who has lost the meaning in everything. The meanings that have run dry are often meanings rooted in what things gave back to us. The job that was satisfying until it stopped. The relationship that was sustaining until it changed. The interest that was alive until it went flat. These are preferential meanings, meanings contingent on a particular kind of return. Kierkegaard would not tell you that these meanings were wrong. He would ask, is there a meaning you could inhabit that does not depend on the return? We continue. The body is settling. The night deepens. Chapter 21. Against the crowd. There is a line attributed to Kierkegaard, not directly from his published works, but drawn from the spirit of everything he wrote, that has become one of the most quietly devastating observations in philosophy. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. Not dramatic despair, not the despair of catastrophe. The ordinary despair of the person who has organized their life around what they were expected to be, or what it was safe to be, or what the people around them needed them to be, and who has, in doing so, gradually become someone other than themselves. This is not a dramatic event. It does not happen in a single decision. It is a slow drift, accumulating across years of small accommodations, small retreats from the genuine. The opinion not expressed because the room was not safe for it. The interest abandoned because it didn't fit the image. The feeling not acknowledged because acknowledging it would have been inconvenient. The path not taken because the path that was taken was the one everyone expected. And one day, often at midlife, often at midnight, the accumulated drift reveals itself. The person looks at the life they have constructed and finds that it is, in many respects, a good life. That it is, in some ways, exactly what they aimed for, and that it feels, in some essential respect, like someone else's. Let the breath move. Feel the weight of the bed. Kierkegaard called the mechanism for this drift the crowd. Not a political crowd, the crowd of expectations, of norms, of what is done and what is not done, and what is said and what is never said aloud. The crowd inside the family, the crowd inside the profession, the crowd inside the culture that has shaped you without asking your consent. The crowd is not malevolent. It is simply the pressure of the collective on the individual. And the individual who does not actively resist, who does not insist on the single individual's right to their own genuine existence, will, over time, be shaped by the pressure until the shape that remains is the crowd's, not theirs. This is not a call to rebellion. Kierkegaard was not advocating for the dramatic overthrow of everything. He was advocating for something quieter and much harder, the daily, internal act of not quite surrendering, of retaining in some private room of yourself the awareness that you are a specific person with a specific existence that no one else can live for you or adjudicate on your behalf. The person who has lost the meaning in everything has often been a very good crowd member. They have given a great deal to the expectations around them. They have been responsible, dutiful, present, accommodating, and the cost of all that accommodation has been the gradual erosion of the thing they were accommodating away from. The meaning did not disappear. It went underground, into the private room that the crowd never reached. That room is still there. The body is heavy and still. We continue. Chapter 22. The third stage is not what you think. We should spend some time on what the third stage is not. It is not a religious conversion in the conventional sense. It is not joining an institution, adopting a set of beliefs, or performing a set of rituals. Kierkegaard spent the last year of his life attacking the Danish Lutheran Church precisely because he believed it had substituted institutional belonging for the genuine third stage movement. He thought the church had made it too easy, had taken the leap and turned it into a ceremony. It is not the arrival of certainty. The knight of faith does not know in the way the system builder knows. He has not solved the problem. He has made a move in the face of the unsolved problem. It is not happiness in any simple sense. The third stage does not remove difficulty or suffering. Abraham did not walk to Mount Moriah feeling cheerful. Kierkegaard himself, by every account, was not a happy man in any straightforward sense. He was alive in a way that was more useful than happiness. And it is not a single event that, once achieved, stays achieved. Kierkegaard thought of the stages as ongoing orientations, not destinations. You do not arrive at the third stage and stop. The movement is always in process, which is why he described it as a relation, an ongoing, dynamic relationship between the self and the ground it rests on. Let your jaw soften, let the breath move. What the third stage is, as precisely as it can be said, it is the willingness to be what you are in your specific finitude, with your specific history and limitations and unresolved questions, while accepting that this specific self is grounded in something beyond its own will, not something that removes the difficulty, something that makes the difficulty bearable without requiring it to be resolved first. Not certainty, not the feeling of certainty, not even the absence of doubt, the willingness to act, to be, to continue in full view of the doubt. The phrase Kierkegaard uses in The Sickness Unto Death, the phrase that resolves the entire architecture of that book, is this: the self that rests transparently in the power that created it. 3 words that carry the weight of everything. Transparently rests. Power that created it. Transparently. Not hiding from yourself. Not performing a version of the self to yourself in the mirror. Seeing yourself with the same clear, non-defensive attention you might direct at something you genuinely care about. Rests, not straining, not forcing, not holding the self together by willpower, a kind of giving up the grip. The power that created it, whatever ground you are willing to accept as beneath your feet, whatever you can call, honestly, the foundation that did not originate in your own will. We will return to this phrase in the final hour. For now, the body is heavy, the room is still, the night is quiet. We continue. Chapter 23. What losing the meaning actually names. We are at the midpoint. If your mind has been drifting, come back gently. You do not need to have followed every word. The parts that matter will find you. Let your body settle. Feel the breath. We have covered a great deal of ground: the life, the stages, the pseudonyms, the books. Let us stop for a moment and ask the question directly. What does the feeling we started with, the loss of meaning, the midnight flatness, the sense that things have stopped calling, what does it name in Kierkegaard's terms? Here is what he would say. It names proximity. The person who has lost the meaning in everything is not standing far from the question that the meaning is the answer to. They are close, uncomfortably close, closer often than the person who has not yet felt the flatness, because the person who has not felt it has not yet arrived at the edge of what their current formula can produce. The aesthetic stage exhausts itself. The ethical stage reaches its ceiling. And in the space where neither is sufficient, in the silence that the performances have been keeping at bay for years, in that space, the question lives. What is the question? It is not, what should I do with my life? That is a practical question. It is a useful question, but it is downstream of the deeper one. The question Kierkegaard was always circling is closer to: who is the self that is going to do anything with anything? Not the performed self, not the crowd-approved self, not the self that has constructed a life from the available materials of expectation and habit and reasonable ambition. The self beneath those, the one that has been there since before the performance started, and that is still there now, in the dark, when the performance has finally stopped for the night. Let your jaw soften. Let the shoulders drop. Most people encounter this self most clearly in moments of failure. When something they were counting on collapses, and they find in the wreckage a self that was underneath the thing that collapsed, still present, still alive, surprised to be discovered. The self that loss reveals, but you do not have to wait for failure. The midnight flatness is its own kind of clearing. When the things that were calling have stopped calling, when the meanings that were organizing have stopped organizing, in that silence, the self that is beneath the organization has the best chance of being noticed. This is not a comfortable claim. It is not designed to make the flatness feel better. It is designed to reframe what the flatness is. Not a malfunction, not evidence of failure or weakness or inadequacy. Evidence of seriousness. Evidence of a self that has arrived at the actual question. The body is heavy. The room is still. We continue into the third hour. Chapter 24. The attack on the church. Kierkegaard has been largely silent for several years. He had a public altercation with a satirical magazine, The Corsair, in 1846, which mocked him in print for months and left him bruised by the experience. He had retreated somewhat from public life. And then Bishop Münster died. Münster had been the head of the Danish Lutheran Church for decades. He had been a figure of great authority in Copenhagen's religious life. He had been, for Kierkegaard, something more than an institutional figure. He had known Kierkegaard's father, had been a presence in Kierkegaard's childhood, had represented something like the established faith of the world Kierkegaard had grown up in. At Münster's funeral, the man who succeeded him gave an address in which he praised Münster as a witness to the truth, one of the great faithful of the Christian tradition. Kierkegaard could not let this go. He had admired Münster in many ways, but a witness to the truth, the head of a comfortable, state-sponsored institution surrounded by deference and power, representing a Christianity that had been emptied of everything demanding, he began to publish pamphlets. He called the publication The Moment. He published 9 issues between 1854 and the autumn of 1855. The pamphlets attacked the Danish church with the full force of his philosophical intelligence and his considerable rhetorical talent. He argued that official Christianity was not Christianity at all, that it had substituted respectability for faith, habit for commitment, institution for the single individual's actual encounter with the question. Let the breath move, the room is still. The attack was not the action of a bitter man. It was, in a strange way, the most consistent action of his life. He had spent 30 years arguing that genuine existence required the single individual to stand before the question without the crowd's support. He had argued that the aesthetic stage, however pleasant, was insufficient. He had argued that the ethical stage, however admirable, could not provide the ground the self required. And he had argued that the third stage, the genuine movement toward what he called faith, was available only to the individual who was willing to accept the difficulty of it without the comfort of an institution to make it easy. He had arrived at the point where he felt compelled to say, the institution is making it too easy. It is offering what feels like the third stage without requiring the actual movement. He was 41 when he began the attack. He was not well. He had been thin and fragile for years. In the autumn of 1855, he collapsed on the street. We are nearly at the end of his life. And we are nearly at the resolution of the question we began with. The body is heavy and still, we continue. Chapter 25. Copenhagen, November 1855. Let your jaw soften, let the chest soften. We are in the third hour now. In October 1855, Soren Kierkegaard collapsed on a street in Copenhagen. He was 42 years old. He was taken to Frederiks Hospital, a public hospital near the center of the city. He stayed there for 6 weeks. Visitors came. His nephew came. His old friend, the priest Emil Boesen, came repeatedly and recorded some of what passed between them. Kierkegaard was lucid, calm, and, in some accounts, strangely at peace, or at least at peace in the specific way he had always talked about peace. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something steady beneath it. He was offered communion by the hospital chaplain. He declined. He wanted it from a layperson. His brother, a bishop, came and offered to arrange for communion. Kierkegaard refused. He did not want a representative of the official church, the church he had just spent a year attacking, to be the one to offer it. He waited for Emil Boesen, who was not formally ordained as a church minister. Boesen was a friend. There is something completely consistent about this. The man who had spent 30 years arguing that genuine faith was available only to the single individual outside the comfort of the crowd died refusing to delegate the final sacrament to an institution. He wanted the human person, not the official role. He died on the 11th of November 1855. Feel the weight of the bed. Feel the breath move. He left behind more than 30 books and pamphlets, most of them written under pseudonyms he later disclosed. He left behind thousands of pages of journals. He left behind a broken engagement he never fully explained, a satire-induced embarrassment he never fully recovered from, a church attack that most of Copenhagen found baffling or alarming. He left behind also the most precise map anyone has drawn of the feeling that visits at midnight. The self that cannot become itself, the dizziness of freedom, the sickness unto death that is not dying but the self's refusal to be what it is. The two kinds of despair: not wanting to be yourself and wanting to be yourself entirely on your own terms. The three stages: aesthetic, ethical, religious, each one partially true, none of them sufficient alone. And the resolution, the self that rests transparently in the power that created it. He died in a hospital bed, 42 years old, at peace with the question, if not with the institution, still himself in the specific way he had always been himself, thin, funny, devastating in argument. Unable to let anything less than the full weight of the thing be what it was. We carry his work forward now into the closing hours. Something shifts here. We are moving toward the resolution. Chapter 26. The philosophers who built on his work. Kierkegaard died in 1,855 inches relative obscurity. His books were in Danish, a small language, and most of them had not been translated into the major European languages. His reputation was local, contested, strange. And then the 20th century arrived, and everything changed. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher who published Being and Time in 1927, was deeply shaped by Kierkegaard. Two of Heidegger's central concepts carry the mark: thrownness, the fact that you are thrown into an existence you did not choose, with a particular history, a particular body, a particular set of circumstances, and authenticity, the call to inhabit that thrown existence genuinely, rather than sinking into what Heidegger called das Man, the anonymous one, the crowd that decides what is proper and proper and proper until the individual's voice is gone. These are Kierkegaardian ideas in German dress. Thrownness is the given. Authenticity is the task of the single individual. Let the breath move. Let the shoulders drop. Jean-Paul Sartre took the next step. Where Kierkegaard had insisted that the self required a ground beyond itself, what he called the power that created it, Sartre stripped that ground away and asked, what if there is no such ground? What if existence precedes essence? What if you are radically free, with no given nature to fulfill and no external ground to rest on? Sartre's answer was that this radical freedom is terrifying and that most people flee it into bad faith. The pretense that you had no choice, that your situation required what you did, that you are your role and nothing more. The resonance with Kierkegaard's crowd is clear. The difference is in what Sartre thought was available as ground. Kierkegaard thought there was ground. Sartre thought there was only the freedom itself. Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, read Kierkegaard and found something different: the I-thou relationship, the encounter between two genuine selves, each irreducible, each fully present as the place where meaning lives. Not in the system, not in the crowd, not even in the solitary individual, but in the genuine meeting. And Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and founded logotherapy, carried forward a Kierkegaardian insight. That meaning is not something you find pre-packaged, waiting to be discovered. It is something you enact. It is discovered in the doing, in the committing, in the accepting of responsibility for a particular existence in a particular set of circumstances. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Frankl wrote this: "It is Kierkegaard in different words. The body is heavy. The night is quiet. We are moving toward the resolution." Chapter 27. Loop Resolution 1. The two kinds of despair. We planted a question at the beginning of this night. We said, there are two kinds of despair Kierkegaard named. By the time we arrived at the second hour, you would recognize which one is yours. We have arrived. Let us name them clearly. The first kind, not wanting to be yourself. The self that runs from its own given nature, that lives in the fantasy of a different self, a corrected self, the self that would finally be acceptable. This despair often presents as ambition, self-improvement, restlessness, the feeling of being in the wrong life. It is not wrong to want to grow. The despair is in the underlying movement, the refusal of the given as the material. The person in this despair is always slightly elsewhere. The meaning they are looking for is always in the future, when they have become the person they are supposed to become. And because the future self never quite arrives as satisfying as imagined, the looking continues. Feel the breath move. Feel the weight of the bed. The second kind, wanting to be yourself on your own terms. The self that has claimed its identity but refuses any ground beyond its own will. This despair presents as self-sufficiency, independence, the refusal of dependency. It often looks like strength. It is strength in some ways, but the strength is in the service of a closed circle, and closed circles eventually become prisons. The person in this despair has built something real. The despair is in the isolation of it, the refusal to let anything outside the circle be the foundation. Most people carry elements of both. The first is more common in youth and in the aesthetic stage. The second is more common in middle life after the ethical stage has delivered its verdict and found it insufficient. Kierkegaard's resolution is not that you should want to be a different person or that you should become dependent. The resolution is stranger and simpler. The self that becomes itself is the self that is received by itself, and by something beyond itself, not by the crowd, not by the institution, but by the honest, non-defensive, ongoing willingness to be what you are, held in a relation you did not create. This is what he meant by the self that rests transparently in the power that created it. Transparently, without hiding from yourself, rests without straining. The power that created it. Whatever ground is real and beneath your specific feet tonight. The despair dissolves not when you stop being in despair, but when the self that was in despair is received by something larger than its own will. Something shifts here. We are moving toward the final third. Chapter 28, Loop Resolution 2, the stage you actually live in. The second question we carried from the opening, the three stages of existence and which one you inhabit. Let us resolve this now. The aesthetic stage is the stage of immediacy, of living for what feels good, of chasing the next thing that promises relief from the flatness. You know when you are in this stage because you are always waiting for the next thing to begin. The current thing is not quite it. The current job, the current relationship, the current city, all of them placeholders for something that will finally satisfy. There is nothing wrong with pleasure. There is nothing wrong with beauty. The aesthetic stage becomes insufficient not because it is immoral, but because sensation alone cannot sustain a self. The flatness that arrives when the pleasures run thin is not punishment, it is information. This is not the foundation you are looking for. The ethical stage is the stage of commitment, of duty, obligation, the deliberate organization of the self around what is right. You know when you are in this stage because you are organized, responsible, accountable, and yet lying awake at midnight wondering what it was all for. You have done what was required. The doing was real, and the doing alone is not enough. Let your jaw soften. Let the chest soften. The third stage is not a stage you arrive at and stay in. It is a movement, a willingness, an ongoing orientation. You know when you are approaching it because the performing has thinned, because the midnight flatness has persisted long enough that the usual escapes have lost their power, because you are left, finally, with the question rather than any of its diversions. The person who has lost the meaning in everything is standing at the boundary, not inside the third stage, but facing toward it. The aesthetic satisfactions have run dry. The ethical framework has reached its ceiling, and what remains is the question itself. What ground am I standing on, if not pleasure and not duty? Kierkegaard's answer is not a theological proposition to be believed. It is a move to be made. The move of accepting that the self requires a ground it did not create. The move of receiving your own existence as given, rather than as a problem to be solved or a project to be completed. Most people make this move, if they make it, slowly, in small increments, not dramatically. The knight of faith, remember, looks like a local businessman going about his day. The stage you live in tonight is the stage from which you can see the next one, and seeing it is most of the work. The body is heavy and still. We carry this into the final hour. Chapter 29, The Moment. Kierkegaard had a concept he called the moment, the øjeblikket in Danish, the blink of an eye, the instant. He meant something very specific by it. Not a moment in time, not a duration measured in seconds or minutes. The moment is a qualitative event, the point at which the eternal intersects with the temporal. The point at which something that transcends ordinary clock time breaks through into clock time. For Kierkegaard, this was primarily a theological concept, the incarnation, the moment of conversion, the encounter with the divine. But the structure of the concept reaches beyond theology. Think of the moments in your own life when time stopped working the way it usually does. Not when something dramatic happened. Often it is the opposite. The moment when you looked at someone you love and felt fully present. The moment when you were absorbed in a piece of work and the work was alive. The moment when something that had always been abstract suddenly became real. When you understood something not just with your mind, but with your whole self. These are not romantic exaggerations. They are, Kierkegaard would say, encounters with what the moment actually is, the breaking in of something real. Let your breath move. Let the jaw soften. The opposite of the moment is not boredom. It is what Kierkegaard would call immediacy without reflection, the continuous flow of time without any point of depth, the life in which nothing quite lands because nothing quite interrupts the flow long enough to be received. The person who has lost the meaning in everything has often lost it because the moments have stopped arriving, or because they have stopped being present enough to receive them when they do. This is not a criticism. It is a description of what happens when the pace of life exceeds the capacity for reception, when the next thing arrives before the last thing has been fully inhabited. Sleep, in this sense, is a moment, not a dramatic one, but the willingness to stop, to put down the day, to lie in the dark, to allow the body to be heavy and the mind to become quiet, is a form of receptivity that the moment requires. You cannot grasp a moment. You can only become available to one. You are doing that right now. The room is still, the night is quiet. We continue toward the close. Chapter 30. What Kierkegaard would say tonight. Let your shoulders drop. Let the chest soften. We are in the final hour. If Kierkegaard were to speak directly to the person who opened this night, feeling that the meaning had gone out of things, not in the language of his published books, not through a pseudonym, but plainly, what would he say? He was not, by all accounts, a warm man in the conventional sense. He was demanding, precise, argumentative, often cutting in his wit. He would not offer easy comfort. That much is certain. But here is what the work suggests. He would say, the flatness is not a mistake. The thing that has stopped calling, the pleasure that has run thin, the duty that has grown hollow, was always going to stop calling. Not because you failed to maintain it, because it was not the foundation. It was never the foundation. It was part of the search. And now you are closer to what the search has always been a search for. He would say, you are not broken. The self that cannot become itself is not a broken self. It is a self that is still in motion, still close enough to its own life to feel the gap between where it is and where it is meant to be. The gap is evidence of something. The person who feels nothing does not feel the gap. Let the breath move. Nothing here asks anything of you. He would say, the crowd cannot help you here, not because the people in it are wrong, but because this is not a crowd-size question. It is a single individual question. The meaning you are looking for is not in the consensus. It is not in what everyone else seems to have figured out. It is in the specific, irreducible fact of your own existence, the particular history, the particular limitations, the particular gifts, the particular set of unresolved questions that no one else has in quite the same arrangement. And he would say, finally, the move is not a destination. The knight of faith looks like an ordinary person going about his day, because the move is woven into the ordinary. It is not a conversion experience or a vision or a dramatic turning. It is the ongoing, quiet willingness to be who you are, held by something larger than your own will, without requiring that holding to feel a certain way. The self that rests transparently in the power that created it. Not the self that has arrived, the self that is willing to rest. You are lying in the dark. Your body is heavy. Your mind has been walking through Copenhagen with a thin man who understood something about this. You do not need to arrive tonight. You only need to rest. Chapter 31. What the journals revealed. In the thousands of pages of Kierkegaard's private journals, there is a quality that the published books, for all their brilliance, do not quite have. Uncertainty. The books are masterful. They are precise, beautifully argued, often devastating in their accuracy, but they are constructed, they are shaped. They are the result of a philosophical intelligence at full power. The journals are something else. They are the man himself sitting with the question at 2 a.m., not sure of the answer, not performing for anyone. There is an entry from the last years, scholars date it to the early 1850s, the period just before the attack on the church, in which Kierkegaard writes about the difficulty of living what he taught. He had spent years arguing that the genuine self requires the willingness to be received, to rest on a ground beyond itself. And he acknowledged in the private pages that he did not always experience this himself, that the restlessness was still there, that the questions were still there. He did not resolve this by pretending the restlessness was gone. He held it. He kept writing. He kept examining. He died, by all accounts, without having arrived at the kind of settled peace that his theology pointed toward. Let the breath move. Let the jaw soften. This is perhaps the most honest thing about him. He did not perform the answer he was working toward. He worked toward it, in public and in private, to the end of his life, and never quite completed the journey. And yet the work he left is not a monument to failure. It is a monument to the seriousness of the attempt, to the quality of being someone who takes the question seriously enough to keep working on it even when the answer does not arrive on schedule. The person who lies awake at midnight wondering where the meaning has gone is doing something similar. They have not given up. They have not stopped caring. The caring is precisely what makes the night difficult. If they had stopped caring, the flatness would feel comfortable rather than wrong. The wrongness is the seriousness. The dissatisfaction is the evidence that the self is still alive in the thing that matters. Kierkegaard would recognize this. He would not comfort it away. He would say, yes, keep going. The question is the right one. And then he would go back to his desk and write some more. The body is heavy, the room is still. We continue. Chapter 32. The Philosophers who found their way through. Grounding. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of the body where it rests. Nothing here asks anything of you tonight. We have been walking with Kierkegaard for several hours. Let us hear for a few minutes the voices of some of the others who sat with similar questions and found their way through. Albert Camus was not a Kierkegaardian. He explicitly disagreed with Kierkegaard on the question of the leap, arguing that Kierkegaard's leap was a philosophical suicide, a refusal to remain with the question rather than an honest answer to it. But Camus arrived at his own form of resolution, and it has something in common with what Kierkegaard was pointing toward. Camus called it the absurd, the confrontation between the human need for meaning and the silence of the universe in response to that need. And his advice was not to flee the confrontation by leaping into faith, but to remain in it with defiance. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The boulder always rolls back. The pushing is the thing. The being fully present to the particular, specific, irreducible task in front of you is where the meaning lives. Let the breath move. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, arrived at a similar conclusion by a different route. He observed that the prisoners who survived, not always, not mechanically, but with striking consistency, were those who had maintained some sense of meaning in their situation. Not the meaning of the situation, which was objectively meaningless, but the meaning they chose to inhabit, the commitment to survive for someone, to bear witness, to carry forward what had been learned. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Frankl, quoting Nietzsche, in the context of the camps. The why is not given, it is enacted. And Blaise Pascal, 3 centuries before either of them, sat in his cold room and wrote the fragment we have already carried, that the restlessness is not evidence of a broken self. It is evidence of a self that is still oriented towards something that has not yet been found. The restlessness is the compass needle, pointing. It is not the destination, but it is not meaningless either. These voices, Camus, Frankl, Pascal, Kierkegaard, do not agree on the destination. They agree on something more important, that the question is real, and that the person who takes it seriously enough to keep sitting with it is not failing. They are, in the fullest sense, alive. The body is heavy. The night is quiet. We are nearly at the end. Chapter 33. Loop Resolution 3. The Secret in the Hard Book. We have been carrying a third question since the beginning of this night. We said, there is a secret in Kierkegaard's most difficult book. Something hidden in plain sight, in the sickness unto death, that changes how the whole map is read. Here it is. Most people, when they hear the word despair, assume its opposite is hope. The person in despair has lost hope. The remedy is to restore it. Find reasons to be optimistic. Look at what is good. Count your blessings. Generate hope where hope has run thin. Kierkegaard's claim And this is the claim that Anticlimacus buries near the end of that dense and difficult book, is that this is wrong, not useless, not irrelevant, but wrong at the level of the diagnosis, and therefore wrong at the level of the remedy. Despair, in his sense, is not the opposite of hope. It is the opposite of faith. And faith, as we have seen across this night, is not a feeling. It is not optimism. It is not the confident expectation of a good outcome. It is something structural, a relationship between the self and the ground beneath the self. The quality of resting transparently in the power that created it. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath move. This distinction matters enormously at midnight, because the person who has lost the meaning in everything cannot, by act of will, generate hope. They know this. They have tried. The effort to convince yourself to be hopeful when the well is dry is one of the most exhausting things a person can do. It treats despair as an emotional malfunction, a feeling that can be corrected by generating the opposite feeling. But if despair is the opposite of faith rather than the opposite of hope, then the remedy is not an emotional correction. It is a structural move. Not try harder to feel hopeful, but try to become available to the ground. What ground? Whatever is actually beneath your feet, whatever you can honestly call, tonight, the thing that did not originate in your own will, the body which you did not design, the breath which is happening on its own, the darkness which surrounds you without requiring anything from you. These are small grounds, but they are real, and the willingness to rest on something real, even something small, even something you cannot name grandly, that willingness is the structural beginning of what Kierkegaard meant by faith. The secret is this: you do not need to feel hopeful. You need to be willing to rest. And resting is something the body already knows how to do. Let the shoulders drop. Let the body be heavy. We carry this forward. Chapter 34. Returning to the room. Let us return to where we started. It is late. The house has gone quiet. The silence that settles over a building when everyone in it has finally stopped moving. Not the silence of a room, but the deeper silence of a whole building at rest. You are still awake. Or you were at the beginning of this night. Perhaps by now, the sleep is closer than it was. The body is heavier than it was 4 hours ago. Something has been put down, or at least set aside. The day has receded further. The performances that organized the daylight hours are quiet now. Kierkegaard walked through Copenhagen alone most nights. He called it his people bath. He needed the noise of the city, the brief contacts, the faces on the street, before he could settle into the silence of his desk. By midnight, he was usually back. By dawn, usually exhausted. He slept through the mornings. He understood, practically and philosophically, the relationship between the long walk and the rest. You cannot move from the noise of the day directly into genuine quiet. The mind needs the walk first, the gradual slowing, the conversation with itself, the processing of what the day left unfinished. That is what this night has been. A walk. Let the breath move. Let the jaw soften. Let the chest be soft. We have walked through the wool merchant's house on Nightorv Square, and the young man who grew up inside its heavy atmosphere. We have walked through the broken engagement with Regine, and the years Kierkegaard spent writing for a woman who did not know he was writing for her. We have walked through the aesthetic stage, and the ethical stage, and the difficult third stage. We have sat with the two kinds of despair, the three stages of existence, and the phrase that contains Kierkegaard's deepest resolution: the self that rests transparently in the power that created it. You are that self, not the performed self that one is tired and nearly asleep, the one beneath. The one that was there before the performances began and will be there when they end. The room is still. The night is quiet. Nothing moves. Let the body settle further into the bed. Let the pillow receive the weight of the head. Let the hands be still wherever they are. Something shifts here. We are entering the final portion of the night. Chapter 35. The Self that Rests. We have returned to the phrase several times tonight. Let us live in it now, slowly. The self that rests transparently in the power that created it. Each word is doing something. The self, not the ideal self, not the corrected self, not the self as you believe it should be, after the work you still have to do once the circumstances have improved. The self as it currently is, with its specific history, specific limitations, specific unresolved questions, the actual material. This body in this room tonight. That rests, not that achieves, not that resolves or completes or improves, not that becomes what it was supposed to become, in the way it was supposed to become it, on the schedule it was supposed to follow. That rests. The verb is deliberate. Rest does not require the completion of the task. It only requires the willingness to stop performing the task for now, transparently. This is the word that carries the most weight. To be transparent to yourself means to see yourself without the protective distortions that make the seeing comfortable. Not to condemn what you see, not to fix it immediately, simply to see it. The restlessness, the flatness, the places where the self has been running and the places where it has been hiding, without flinching away. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath move on its own, in the power that created it, not in your own will, not in your own plans, not in the self-constructed image of who you are and what you are worth. In the thing that was there before any of that, before the plans, before the performances, before the decisions about who to be and how to appear, in whatever you can honestly call, tonight, the ground. It does not have to be a name you are comfortable with. It does not have to be a theological proposition. It can be as quiet as the fact that you are breathing without trying, that the heart is beating without being asked, that the darkness is here and holding everything in it without requiring anything back. That is a kind of power. It created this. It created you, if only in the sense that it was here before your first deliberate thought and will be here after your last one. To rest in that transparently without the performance is what Kierkegaard meant by the resolution of despair. Not the end of difficulty, not the achievement of peace as a permanent state, but this, the willingness to be held, for now, by something larger than your own will. The body already knows how to do this. Let it. Chapter 36. Either or. The title of Kierkegaard's first great book, Either or, sounds like a demand for a decision. Pick one. Decide. Stop dithering. But that is a misreading. The choice Kierkegaard is pointing toward in either or is not a choice between two particular options. It is not either this career or that one, this person or that one, this city or that one. Those are practical choices, and they matter, but they are not what he means. The fundamental either or is the choice to choose or not. The aesthetic person, remember, is the person who does not quite choose. They drift from sensation to sensation, from experience to experience, holding open the possibility that the next thing will be more satisfying than the current one. They resist commitment because commitment closes off other options, and the other options are where the satisfaction might be hiding. The fundamental choice Kierkegaard places before his reader is the choice to stop drifting, to choose the choosing itself, to accept that a life lived from the position of genuine decision, even if the decisions are sometimes wrong, even if they cost something, is a different kind of life than a life lived in perpetual availability. Let the breath move. Let the body be heavy. This is not the ethical stage exactly. It is the move that makes the ethical stage possible. The prior act of deciding to take one's own life seriously enough to choose it deliberately. The person who has lost the meaning in everything is often a person who has been choosing well at the surface level, making the right decisions by the standards others have set, following the expected path, while not quite choosing at the deeper level, not quite claiming their own existence as theirs to inhabit. The either or is not about the next decision. It is about the willingness to decide at all, to say, this is my life, these are my specific circumstances, this specific self is the one I am working with. Not as a resignation, as a beginning. It is very quiet in the room now. The night is very late or very early. The distinction has started to matter less. Let the jaw soften. Let the chest soften. Something is settling that does not need to be named. Chapter 37. What anxiety opens up? We said several hours ago that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. We said that the objectless, hovering unease that visits at midnight is not a malfunction, but a signal, the appropriate response to standing before the open field of your own possibility. Let us add something to that now. The signal is not just that freedom is present. The signal is that freedom is present and has not yet been inhabited. The anxiety persists as long as the freedom is unheld, as long as the person is still hovering, still suspended between the aesthetic stage's exhausted pleasures and the ethical stage's insufficient duties, still unwilling to make the move that the third stage requires. When the move is made, even partially, even tentatively, the anxiety does not disappear, but it changes quality. It becomes less like vertigo and more like aliveness. The difference between the dizziness of someone who has not yet stood at the edge and the dizziness of someone who is genuinely standing there fully and has decided to stay. Feel the weight of the bed. Let the breath move. There is a quality to deep rest that has something in common with the third stage. Sleep is a form of the leap, a daily, modest, ordinary surrender of control. You cannot make yourself sleep by trying harder. You can only make yourself available. You release the grip, you stop managing, and in the space that the management filled, something that was already present can surface. The anxiety of this particular night, the lying awake, the midnight flatness, the feeling that the meaning has gone out of things, has been the dizziness of a freedom you have not yet stood in. The question has been open all along. The hovering has been the question's way of asking. You have been listening, in the dark, to a man who spent his life holding that question open without collapsing it into an easy answer. And now the night is nearly over. Let the jaw soften. Let the hands be still. The question does not need to be answered tonight. It only needs to be acknowledged, to be received as a real question rather than a symptom to be managed. That much is already done. Chapter 38, The Long Walk Back. Kierkegaard's last entry in his journals is dated the 25th of September, 1855. He collapsed on the street 2 weeks later, October 2nd. The entry is short. He was already weakening. He wrote about faith, not the theological architecture of it, not the stages or the paradoxes, but the simple daily practice, the willingness to receive the day, the willingness to be what he was without requiring it to be different. He had been asking the same question for 40 years. He had not resolved it in the way a mathematical problem is resolved. He had deepened into it. There is a form of arrival that does not look like arriving. It looks like continuing. It looks like the person who has been walking for a long time and has stopped expecting to reach a destination and has started to understand that the walking was always the thing. Not aimless walking. Walking with direction, with seriousness, with the willingness to be changed by where the road leads. But walking, not arriving. Let the breath move. Let the chest soften. The Long Walk Back, the title of this chapter, is not a walk back to somewhere you have been before. It is a walk back to yourself. The self that has been there under all the performances. The self that does not require a system or a stage to be real. You have been on that walk tonight. 4 hours of philosophy at midnight is not an intellectual exercise. It is a form of company. Someone walking beside you in the dark, saying, "Yes, I know this road. I have been here." The flatness is not the end of the road. It is a particular stretch of it, and the stretch has a name. The name is despair, and despair, as Kierkegaard understood it, is not the end. It is what the self feels when it is close to the question it has been circling. You are close. Let the jaw soften. Let the body be heavy. The house is still. The night is very late. Something is almost here. Chapter 39. What meaning looks like when it returns. It does not arrive with announcement. This is the part that most people misunderstand, because the flatness has been so loud, in its quiet way, that they expect the return of meaning to be equally loud. A surge of feeling, a sense of certainty, a sudden conviction that things matter and the reasons for mattering are clear. It is almost never like that. What Kierkegaard described, and what the people who have lived through the territory he mapped tend to confirm, is that the return of meaning is more like the gradual recognition of something that was always there. Not a new thing arriving, an old thing being received finally without the defenses. A conversation with someone you love that suddenly is not performance. A morning that arrives with a quality of being actually present in it. A piece of work that asks something from you and you are unexpectedly available to give it. A small kindness you did not plan and that cost you nothing except attention. These are not dramatic events. They are the knight of faith going about his ordinary day. Let the jaw soften, let the chest be soft. The return of meaning does not require you to have resolved the question. It does not wait for the philosophy to be finished, or the therapy to be complete, or the life to be in order. It arrives when it arrives, in the specific given circumstances of the actual existing day. This room, this night, this body, these unresolved questions. Kierkegaard would say, this is the material. This is not the waiting room before the real life begins. This is it. And in the acceptance of that, the full, non-defensive reception of this as the actual material, something that has been held at arm's length, is finally allowed to be close. This is what the self that rests transparently in the power that created it feels like when the resting is real. Let the body settle. The night is almost done. Chapter 40. The room grows quieter. The room is very quiet now. Your body has been horizontal for several hours. The weight of it has settled fully into the bed. The places where the body holds tension, the jaw, the shoulders, the hands, the forehead, have had the chance to soften one by one as the night went on. Let them soften now if they have not. Jaw, the muscles that hold the face in the shape it wears through the day. Let them go. Shoulders, the weight that the body carries forward through the hours. Let them fall back. Hands, wherever they are, open, still. The breath moves on its own. It has been moving on its own all night. It does not require your participation. It does not require your approval. It is simply here, doing the work that keeps everything else going, without being asked. This is, in its way, what Kierkegaard meant by the ground, the thing that is here without being earned, the breathing that continues during sleep, during despair, during the flattest of the flat midnight hours, the body continuing to do what it does, regardless. You did not create this. It created you in the specific sense that it was operating before you had a conscious thought and will continue when the conscious thoughts have gone quiet for the night. Rest in that, not dramatically, quietly. The way the breath rests in the lungs, the way the body rests in the bed. Let the weight go further down, further than you think it can go. There is always more letting go available. The house is still. We are very near the end. Chapter 41. The Sound of Copenhagen. He walked the streets almost every night. Thin, with the slightly irregular gait that his curved spine produced, bundled against the cold, stopping to talk to people he barely knew, the shopkeeper, the chimney sweep, the student. He had a gift for conversation with anyone. He could be funny, in the satirical way that made people feel they had been seen. He could be devastating. He could be warm. By midnight he was usually back at his desk, the lamp lit, the journal open. He wrote in a hand that grew smaller and smaller as the page filled, cramming ideas into the margins when the columns ran out. He was always writing toward the same question. What does it mean to be a single individual, alive, in a particular time and place, with a particular set of given circumstances and a particular set of questions that no system can dissolve? He never finished answering it. He kept writing, and in the keeping, in the willingness to sit at the desk, night after night, year after year, with the question still open and the lamp still burning, he did something that his readers have recognized for nearly 2 centuries. He kept company with the question in a way that makes the question feel less lonely. Let the breath move. You will not solve the question of your own existence tonight, neither did he. But you have spent 4 hours in its company, in the company of a man who understood it from the inside, who mapped it with precision and honesty, who never pretended it was simpler than it is. That is something. Late at night, in the dark, that is something real. The lamp is still on, or it was. The image we carry from the thumbnail, the oil lamp on the desk in the near black room, the manuscript scattered, the face of the thin man looking down at the page. Now the lamp is going out, slowly. The flame still there, but smaller. Let the jaw soften. Let the eyes be still behind their lids. We are almost there. Chapter 42. The Given. Before the final rest, one more thing. The given. This is Kierkegaard's word for the material you did not choose. The body you were born into, the family, the century, the country, the temperament, the capacity for feeling. The history of everyone who came before you and left their marks in you without asking permission. The given. Most of us spend a great deal of energy in a quiet argument with the given, wishing it were different, trying to correct it, feeling that the given was somehow unfair, that the people who received better given material have an advantage that is not quite just, And there is something to that argument. Some givens are genuinely harder than others. Some histories carry more weight. Some bodies come with more difficulty. The argument is not always wrong. But the argument, when it becomes the primary orientation toward the given, costs something very large. It costs the energy that would otherwise go into actually inhabiting the given, using it, finding what is possible within it rather than perpetually comparing it to what would be possible in a better given. Let the breath move. Let the body be heavy. Kierkegaard thought the given was the actual material of the self, not a limitation to be overcome, but the specific form that this particular self has been handed to work with. The wool merchant's son, not someone else's son. The thin body, not a different body. The melancholy, not a cheerful temperament. The father's secret, not a father with no secrets. The work of becoming oneself is the work of receiving the given, fully, non-defensively, without the protective argument, and then choosing what to do with it. Not with resignation. With something closer to the curiosity that a craftsman brings to unusual material. This is what I have. What is possible here? The question is genuinely open, and the asking of it, honestly, from inside the specific given of your own life, is the beginning of the third stage that Kierkegaard spent his life trying to describe. The room is still. The breath moves. We are nearly done. Chapter 43. What Kierkegaard left. What he left behind, finally, is this. A way of holding the question, not an answer. A way of holding it that does not require an answer in order to keep going. A posture toward the difficulty of being alive that neither collapses into despair nor flees it with false comfort. He called it the self that rests transparently in the power that created it. He did not live it perfectly. The journals make that clear. He was restless to the end. He was difficult. He was funny and devastating, and sometimes unkind. But he held the question, and in the holding, in the refusal to make it smaller than it is or to resolve it too quickly into something manageable and therefore false, he did something that the people who have read him across a century and a half keep recognizing. He kept them company. That is what this night has been. Company in the dark, with the question. Let the jaw soften. Let the shoulders be still. Let the hands be open. The breath moves on its own. Chapter 44. The body already knows. The mind has been walking for 4 hours. The body has been still. The body knows something the mind has been slowly learning tonight. It knows how to receive. It has been receiving the pillow, the darkness, the warmth, the breath, without effort, without decision, without the performance that the day requires. The body has been doing the third stage all along. The self that rests transparently in the power that created it. The body does this in sleep every night. It gives up control. It releases the grip on managing. It allows the processes it did not design, the breath, the heartbeat, the slow repair of everything the day cost, to go on without oversight. The mind is the slow learner here, but the mind has been learning. Let it follow the body now. Let the weight go further into the bed. Let the jaw be soft. Let the eyes be still. The room is very dark and very quiet. Something is very close. Chapter 45. The lamp is out. The lamp on the desk in Copenhagen. The thin man has gone to bed. The manuscripts are still on the desk. The inkwell is dry. The journal lies open at the last page. The last entry in the cramped hand. The question still there, still open, still honest. The question does not require a final answer tonight. It requires a night, and then another morning, and the question still there, and the willingness to sit with it still present. That is enough. It has always been enough. Let the breath be slow. Let the body be heavy. Let the mind be quiet. The room holds everything in it. You are here. That is the given. Let it be enough tonight. Chapter 46. What the night has been. It has been a long walk. Through Copenhagen, through the wool merchant's house, through the engagement and the breaking of it, through the books and the pseudonyms and the attack on the church and the hospital bed, through the aesthetic stage and the ethical stage and the third stage that is not a destination, through the two kinds of despair named and held, through the concept of anxiety, the dizziness of freedom, and the concept of repetition, the forward reception of what was thought to be lost, through the single individual, against the crowd, into the self, and back to this room, the room where you started, the same room, but something has shifted, something that does not need to be named yet. The kind of shift that happens when you have spent time in the company of a serious question and let the company do its work. Let the jaw be soft. Let the hands be open. Let the chest be soft. The breath moves. The night is almost done. Let the eyes be still. Chapter 47. The self that rests, not the self that has arrived. The self that is willing to rest, not the self that has resolved the question. The self that has agreed to carry it gently rather than at arm's length. Not the self that performs. The self that is here, in this room, in this body, in this particular arrangement of given and chosen and still to be decided, resting transparently. In the power that created it, the breath moves. The body is heavy. The room is still. The night holds everything. You are here. That is enough. Let the weight go. Let the jaw be soft. Let the hands be open. Let the eyes be still. The sleep is very close. Let it come. You have been walking. Rest now. The lamp in Copenhagen went out a long time ago. The journals are still there. The question is still there. And so is this. The self that rests in the power that created it, let the breath go slow. Let everything go slow. The room, the dark, the weight, the breath, close now. Chapter 48. The hour after midnight. We started here. The house gone quiet. The deeper silence. The body horizontal in the dark. The feeling that had no name. Now it has one. And the name is not an ending. It is an address. A place where the question lives. and where the person who is serious enough to feel the question lives also. You have been that person tonight. You still are. The room is still. The breath moves. The hands are open. The jaw is soft. Nothing is required. Nothing presses. The morning will come when it comes. For now there is this, the dark, the quiet, the body receiving the night, the self that rests. Let it rest. Sleep now.